I'm going to move on now to a few of the findings from the non-profit survey. I think everyone will have seen in the media over the last few years actually, there's been numerous reports of how NPOs are battling, non-profits are battling to get funding, and a number of them are having to close down. Our research wasn't as clear-cut. So we surveyed just almost 200 non-profits, and what we found is that 38% of them reported a decline in their income over the last year. And this is a similar figure to what we found last year. So more of them reported a decline than an increase, but still it was less than half that reported a decline. Those that experienced the biggest decline were non-profits whose income was between $500,000 and $1 million. And a third of non-profits actually stated last year that their income had increased. But when we looked at how much it had increased by, the average increase was really small. It was only 1%. So if you take inflation into account, that's not really a real increase in their income. I think the other thing that's important to recognize is, yes, there's deteriorating funding conditions for non-profits, and I know we have a lot of non-profits here, and we will be talking more about that at the conference. But what this slide shows is that non-profits have a number of funding and income sources. So corporates aren't the only one. What it does show is that corporates are the biggest one, and certainly from our sample, corporates provide almost a quarter of non-profit income. The next biggest provider of non-profit income is the government, with just over 20%. And then foreign donors, both private and government, for another 20%. What we see is that self-generated income is still pretty low for non-profits. And when we measured this last year, it was at 8% of income. And I know this is another topic that's been very spoken about in recent years, and it will be one that we cover in the supporting enterprises theme of this conference. We'll be looking at how some non-profits have developed income generation activities. The flip side of this was a question to corporates saying, where does your CSI expenditure go? And by far the majority of it does go to non-profits. So over 90% of corporates fund non-profits, and non-profits get 55% of corporate expenditure. So most of the CSI money is going to these non-profits, and then obviously the non-profits have a number of other income sources as well. As you can see here, the second biggest recipient of CSI money is actually government institutions. And by that we mean schools, universities, hospitals, clinics. So a lot of that could be bursaries that go to universities or to schools and stuff like that. One thing that we've also been tracking for a number of years, and that we know is a big issue for non-profits, is the willingness of corporates to fund different types of costs. And while all corporates fund project costs, we're finding that there are still a quarter of corporates that don't and will not fund operating costs. Now, this is obviously a big issue for the non-profits, and when we answer the question, over 40% of the non-profits in our survey say that they have to do separate kind of fundraising exercises just to cover their operating costs. I mean, we would certainly encourage companies to think about supporting non-profits' operating costs, at least an amount proportional to the projects that are being funded, because this is one of the big issues that non-profits face in terms of trying to separately fundraise for their operating costs. What this chart also shows, the red left-hand side, is that the vast majority of corporates will not fund the endowment funds or reserves of non-profits. So I just want to summarize what all those numbers show us before I move on. And what we're seeing is significant growth in expenditure and consistent growth over a 10-year period. We've seen that companies also are the biggest source of non-profit funding at around a quarter of their income. And then in terms of where the money goes, national projects receiving 30% of the money and education receiving over 40%. And these trends are consistent with what we found last year. So we have continued to see kind of growth in education and growth in national projects and content projects, as well as growth in the overall number. As I mentioned, we think a large portion of that is because of better measurement.